Hello and welcome back to the Bird channel, where we talk about stories and I stream 5 days a week, 4 hours a day on twitch.tv/Xiii. Today I want to talk about the idea that stories in media need a moment to get going. Sometimes a lot of moments. You ever have a friend like that? They'll recommend a show or a game and say something along the lines of, "Oh no, it's boring at the start, but I promise it gets better next season." Or, "Yeah, the game has a really slow opening, but after the first 20 hours, it's fantastic." Most people I've talked to find that this is a bit off-putting when it comes to starting a show. I barely have time to eat breakfast every day, and you think I have time to sit through several days worth of a slog just to get to the good part? But is that really fair? I'm going to defend the viewpoint that no, long intros to a show are not inherently a bad thing, and no, detailed lore in your video games is not a bad thing either. In fact, it helps stories stick with me longer most times. So, gather around the fire and let me tell you a tale.
Back in the days when fairy tales were simple, I have a video about that too, in case you're interested. Stories were short and to the point. You could fit a solid lesson in a minute if you talked very fast, but as the years progressed, we slowly moved away from quick, tell them before the wolf attacks campfire stories to the more Tolkien-esque way of telling a story. Environments were elaborate and it took several pages to properly note down. If you just want to follow the story in a Tolkien novel, then you can skip a good deal of the pages. But those pages are still important. Why are they important? Because they serve to transport you to the world of the books. When you can read about the trees surrounding the characters in detail, the sea, what it smelled like, their clothing, your mind's eye has a much easier time translating that into images in your head.
And the tree was luscious.
A luscious tree. Yeah, I can see it.
Its bark was rough and weathered.
It's almost like I'm there.
Moss grew in patches around the ancient roots.
Okay, yeah, I get it. It's a good tree.
Final rays of the sun shone verdantly through the leaves.
Is verdantly a word?
Yes, it is. The fog hung heavy around the tree's tops.
Will you shut up about the tree and get on with it?
The Muppets sat down at the roots of this luscious tree, whose bark
I hate
was
trees.
rough and
In that sense, slow starts for books were definitely an improvement. No longer were tales set to spread a moral message alone. I like building a fantasy replica of the world in my head, so this suits me perfectly. Shows and games don't need that sort of extra baggage, however, given that they're a visual medium. But somehow they've also adopted a very slow gait, especially at the very beginning. In most cases, we call that the slow burn. A lot of newer shows now take several episodes to really get to the meat of the story. Episode 1 might introduce the characters, sometimes they'll even take 2 episodes. Next we talk about the setting, episode 4 might speak of the actual problems we're going to face throughout the series.
And all of that might sound like a terrible slog, but is it really? How did older shows handle this, if they did at all? Well, they largely didn't. Back in the olden days, most shows didn't really have very long starts. In fact, a lot of them didn't even have very tangible, overarching storylines either. There are outliers, of course, like Twin Peaks, to take one extreme, but by and large, the shows focused on so-called Monster of the Week type content. I'm calling it Monster of the Week for simplicity's sake, but it goes for sitcoms and such all the same. It's the type of show that starts over every episode. Shows like The X-Files, Friends, Buffy, That 70s Show, and so on and so forth. While each season still had a certain point they generally work towards as a grand finale, the strength of this format was the ability to let anyone enjoy any singular episode.
The first season of Buffy the Vampire Slayer very clearly meant to lead up to an eventual confrontation between the group and a big bad called the Master. But every episode up to that point had mainly been about an entirely different enemy. Sometimes vaguely connected to the Master, other times they weren't related even in the least. But a few scenes would merely show us that, hey, the Master still existed. A setup like this meant that even if you weren't an avid follower of the show, you could still fall into the middle of a season and enjoy that episode on its own. Sure, you didn't know who the Master was, but you also didn't have to, because we were too busy dealing with whatever threat that episode had come up with. And many other shows that didn't have literal monsters to deal with operated in much the same way. A new mystery every week, a new social dilemma or what have you, something that could be dealt with in around 20 or so minutes.
Oh no! Monsters everywhere! How are we going to get out of this mess now, Duffy? I'll use my expert fighting training and a lot of gumption. Good idea! You're absolutely trashing them! Ha! We won't see them for a while.
A few moments later.
Hey, Duffy, I don't mean to alarm you, but there's a brand new monster waiting to kill us. Oh yeah, I know. Wait, you know? You only just got out of the hospital after our last scrap. Come to think of it, don't you think it's weird that there's a new monster waiting for us every single week? Well, we are sitting on top of a hellmouth, and it's a new episode too. A new episode? Hi!
The characters within the show would still change, of course. Relationships would be started and ended, characters left the show. If you did follow the story week to week, you'd certainly get something extra out of the experience, but it never pressed the fun entirely for anyone who didn't. At most, a TV run would have 2-parters, and in that case, the second episode would usually start with someone saying, "Previously on," in a very ominous voice, followed by a quick summary of what happened in the episode before. Some shows still do that, although I can't really imagine why, because of one simple addition to the media landscape: video on demand.
Yes, services like Netflix and Disney Plus remove the necessity for this type of format entirely. Whereas before, it worked out beautifully because you might miss an episode here or there. That's no longer the case. No more setting your VHS player to record so you could tape the latest Dinosaurs episode. Nowadays, you can just start with episode 1 on your own time and continue watching the rest at your own pace. When the TV guide dictated when and where you'd be watching your favorite show, it was a lot easier to miss stuff. Not anymore though, and everyone's taking full advantage of that fact by actually taking their time to slowly build up a story. But before we go on, how does that relate to video games then? They seem to have gone the same way, and video games were always on demand.
That's entirely true, of course, but also not. We all remember the oldest video games, or maybe not, maybe it's just me because I'm old now, but they weren't exactly story-heavy in their execution. We had games like Pong, Frogger, Mario. Arcade games were not meant for any one person to play consistently, nor in one long sitting. You were meant to quickly go for the highest score, and if you couldn't, then, well, tough. Get another quarter or move out of the way for the next person. Even when home systems were introduced to the wider public, that didn't really change much initially. We could play arcade games at home now, but we didn't yet have the ability to save. That didn't happen until The Legend of Zelda, a game that had something of a distinct story. Still, Zelda also didn't have a very deep story to go on yet, but it would later on. However, as time goes on, it seems that the introduction in these games generally lasts longer and longer. It isn't that often that you're simply thrown into the gameplay from the start, and it just keeps going from there. Even if there's an opening play that lasts a few minutes, you usually have a moment of quiet soon after to explain who you are, where you are, why you're there, your friends, your enemies, your goal. As games have gotten story heavier, they've also started taking more time to explain their world building.
Once we got to the point where we had a save function and eventually managed to fit a sprawling world and complicated animations onto a single disc, the gaming world ran with it. I don't generally think that's a bad thing, I really don't, but the game has to find a way to balance things, and they don't always do that. Final Fantasy XIII is a game much criticized for its opening for this exact reason. Quite a few hours at the beginning of the game are set in long hallways with enemies who reward no experience alongside cutscenes that explain the, admittedly, rather complicated world you've stepped into in a stilted manner. And even though these are all very pretty looking hallways, it drags. It's very much one of those games that don't really properly get into things until you've bitten through the entry levels, so you're aware of the basics in your current realm. That doesn't mean the game is bad. In fact, I quite like the story in Final Fantasy XIII, but I abhor the start, and for that reason, find it difficult to recommend others play it. Alright, so welcome to Meritocreata. Oh, hello! Adventuring time, eh? Well, yes, after I introduce you to the story, of course. Oh, right. Wouldn't want to make any weird faux pas, would I? Quite. Anyway, have a seat. We'll be here for a while. Wait, hold on. Please, get comfortable. How many books I have to explain our ruling system in depth. Oh no. Since the dawn of time, the races of Under-Earth have banded together to fight. I'm in an exposition cutscene.
And that is a problem both shows and games have in common. We now have all this time and all this space to create the greatest epic of all time. And we're going to use it, dagnabbit. Thankfully, that can work out very well. Largely, I find it prevents a lot of, well, that came out of nowhere moments. But there are times when even though the runtime of a certain story is rather long, the time spent isn't paced in the least. In a video from 2 weeks ago, I talked about Godzilla. And in that video, I also talked about the 3-part series currently available on Netflix. I'm not going to use much footage of that today to ensure I appease the lords and ladies of the copyright hole, but it's not very good. And the biggest problem I have with the series is the pacing and lack of build-up, something a slower burn might have prevented.
Hi, I forgot to insert a spoiler warning here, so here's that spoiler warning. Spoilers for the 3-parter on Netflix for the animated shows for Godzilla. Okay, carry on.
The series is split into 3 parts, each dealing with a different race. The first movie about the human race does its best to convey that their home has been destroyed by Godzilla. And it was really awful, and now we're in space, running away from Godzilla. And it's even more awful. Everything is awful. In the span of a few minutes, we absorb that everyone is losing hope and we're running out of resources fast, so the ship decides to simply throw out the elderly, which causes our main protagonist to get upset, and oh boy.
These movies are a bit of a mess regardless, but listing it like that doesn't help. The movie has the heroes land on Earth once more to fight Godzilla, which they successfully do, only for a bigger Godzilla to show up, which leads into the next movie. In that next movie, we follow the first alien race on their quest to use Mechagodzilla, who turns into Mechagodzilla City, which turns out to be sentient and very willing to absorb living matter into its own being, which is fine, because this alien race is very into that, except they also try to force humanity to do the same. The problem here is that this was never introduced or communicated at any point during the first movie. This is introduced in the second movie and taken as fact. In the first movie, the alien race doesn't really show an interest in becoming machines, nor is it implied that they would use Mechagodzilla City to then take over the world. This is all contained in one single movie, and they, as a threat, are immediately removed this movie as well. So we can move on to the next movie where the final alien race is reintroduced as a suicide cult. Characters that had, in previous movies, explicitly noted how stupid their beliefs were, have now decided that they're actually a big fan of their cult and actively joined them. And once again, all of this is introduced exclusively in this 1.5-hour movie. Well, that came out of nowhere describes this entire series. The first movie talked about so much without much detail at all because it tried to rush its own storyline despite the length of the movie. The characters barely change, and if they do, it's abrupt and disjointed. The creators of this project decided to go for length, but not for substance.
And this is something a slow build-up fixes in parts. We didn't really know much about each character shown, and because they decided to introduce a Monster of the Week type storyline in every movie, nothing made sense. The main character also remains a bland slab of granite throughout the whole thing. When a show or game starts by explaining their world organically, it's much easier to introduce new elements without the audience raising their eyebrows. I'm going to use Stranger Things Season 1 as an example here, and spoilers for Season 1 of Stranger Things, obviously. The first episode deals solely with the introduction of the characters, the disappearance of Will and the mystery surrounding it. We don't see much of the disappearance, that's for us to find out as the show plays out. It's about 45 minutes of introduction. That doesn't mean it's just a bunch of people spouting exposition though, things happen. Exciting things happen, in fact. Meeting these characters is exciting. Wondering about what happened is exciting, and it made me want to find out what was going on. The next episode deals with the fallout from Will's disappearance and even more introduction and background of the various characters. Yes, they're still not done introducing characters and building out their backstory, and all of it keeps happening while still moving the story along and keeping things entertaining.
That's not to say it always works out. Sometimes shows have very strange, convoluted starts that are hard to follow. And I'm sure there are plenty of people who will tell me that they understood everything perfectly fine the first time they watched Dark, but I want you to know that they're lying, and that's a crime. Dark is a really good show, at least in my opinion, but it's a little difficult to get into. That's not the same as a boring start, mind you. Things don't really start coming together until far later in the show, and at that point you look back at the earlier episodes and you can have those little aha moments that I like so much. It makes a full rewatch all the more enjoyable because you pick up on certain things you didn't even realize were important on your first viewing. it makes it frustrating to hear when friends tell me they've dropped the show because it felt convoluted, slow, and overall too confusing to bother with all the way at the start.
And obviously not everyone has to like Dark. I'm sure some of you have watched the whole thing and just didn't like it, and that's perfectly fair. But it's hard to make a full assessment when you can't bring yourself to watching the whole thing. To be clear, that's not the fault of the person watching. They're not lazy or stupid or any other word fans of the show might throw around. The start failed to draw them in. Does that make the show bad? No, but it's certainly not for everyone, and I do feel that a show, any show, is at its best when it can draw a viewer in immediately. Because I will admit that I had to force myself through the start as well after the mantra, "it gets better," was thrown my way one too many times. And in that aspect alone, Dark is a bad show. The drawback to long storylines like these is also that you can't skip the parts you don't really enjoy, because you'll lose track of said storyline. Spoilers also have a much bigger impact on your enjoyment than they would on a Monster of the Week type show.
The slower starts were, as far as I'm concerned, introduced because game directors and showrunners could finally make the epics they wanted. They didn't have to press an hour's worth of story into 20-minute episodes. They could let their imagination run wild and regale us with the history of their world and the tragic backstories of every minor character. Netflix gave us hour-long episodes with 10-episode seasons, but only ever 2 seasons. Video games gave us Red Dead Redemption and Persona 5 because JRPGs have always liked it long. It means we're finally getting stories told that otherwise just wouldn't exist at all. That's simply how things evolved naturally. There are still Monster of the Week shows to be found too, although I'm finding it very difficult to find any, and if you have any recommendations, then please, I'm begging you, share. But the stretching of the runtime has certainly made it weirdly easy to criticize specifically that part, and I don't think that's fair. A lot of shows are not bad or hard to get into because they take their time to introduce us to the world. They're bad because they're badly written in general. Had those shows been short, nothing would have changed. Take Star Trek: The Next Generation, for example. The first season was a drag for the most part, even though they were still in the Monster of the Week format. But because of the lack of conflict and character development, that show didn't really grow into its own thing until season 2, or as I rather prefer, season 3. When at a certain point, everyone desperately wanted to make The Sopranos Part 2, there were certainly a lot more very mediocre shows made. But this change in format shouldn't be to blame for that. You could have a 10-minute episode, but if the pacing is off and the flow nowhere to be found, then yeah, you're going to get bored. I think it's far too easy to pin all of that on a show or game taking too long to get going. The opening to Final Fantasy XIII is bad. It's a bad opening. That's it. The rest of the game I enjoy, but that does not excuse the opening, which is an exposition dump, and nobody likes exposition dumps. Same goes for every TV show and movie that opens with an old man at a fire throwing the book of exposition at you for the first half hour. Just because it's told with good lighting doesn't make it any better. And if a show or a game with one consecutive storyline takes too long to get to the good part, then the whole thing is bad. Because no, it should not take 2 full seasons or 50 hours of gameplay to start enjoying yourself. Who has time for that? But again, that has nothing to do with the format that employs a slower build-up, and everything to do with poor character writing, ham-fisted dialogue, and yet another retelling of the great prophecy du jour that started with the great goddesses of the wind directions who created the planet with their magical, great, big personalities. In conclusion, it's entirely up to your own personal taste. I hope you didn't think this video was going to end differently. I just wanted to have a chat about how storytelling in media changes over time for a bit, and this was my excuse. There are downsides to either format, of course, but when you boil it down, they're very similar in nature, and really the slow burn only gave us more varied and interesting content than we would have gotten if we'd stuck with the Monster of the Week format for the rest of our lives. And imagine if video games had lingered in the arcade format forever. The majority of my favorite games ever made would never have been created. Imagine not having The Witcher, or Mass Effect, Dragon Age, or Red Dead Redemption, Fantasy, BioShock, Metal Gear Solid, Knights of the Old Republic, Nier Automata, Detention. What? No, it's not a franchise, but it's a very good game. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go watch The X-Files. Until another tale finds us.
A very special thank you to Wallguy the Robin, Robertson, Septic, Ray, Mike Sveers, Adrian Packel, Freeman, and Coolstaff for supporting me on Ko-fi and Patreon. I generally have small stories at the end of my videos, but this subject honestly didn't really have a good fit for that, unless I sat here talking for half an hour to emulate a drawn-out intro. So, when that happens, I will instead express my undying gratitude to you. My wonderful Ko-fi and Patreon friends are the reason I'm still here making videos, and I can't possibly thank you enough, but I'll still try. Thank you.